Stop what you are doing and understand this. What happened over the last 72 hours is not a diplomatic complication that gets resolved through another round of talks. It is not a temporary setback in a fragile peace process. It is the operational collapse of the most high-stakes ceasefire agreement attempted in modern Middle Eastern history, a collapse driven by contradictory signals from Washington, unilateral Israeli escalation, and a strategic bottleneck in the Strait of Hormuz that is choking global energy flow in real time. On Wednesday, April 8, 2026, with less than 48 hours remaining before the 2-week U.S.-Iran ceasefire was set to expire, Israel executed a coordinated air campaign across Lebanon of such intensity and scale that it rendered the ceasefire framework operationally meaningless before anyone in Washington could formulate a response. More than 100 targets struck across 5 Lebanese cities in a 10-minute operational window. 303 people confirmed dead, over 150 injured. Rescuers still pulling bodies from rubble in Beirut's Dahiyeh, in Nabateh, in Tyre, in Sidon, in Baalbek. Entire residential blocks reduced to concrete dust. And Israel's official justification, that every strike targeted Hezbollah military positions, is contradicted by casualty figures that include women, children, and civilian infrastructure destroyed in neighborhoods where no military activity had been documented. Iran's response came within hours. A statement from the Foreign Ministry in Tehran calling the strikes a serious violation of the ceasefire terms and warning that a strong response is being prepared. Not threatened. Prepared. The language is deliberate. Tehran is not posturing. It is calculating. And while diplomatic channels between Washington and Tehran remain technically open, the operational reality on the ground in Lebanon and in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz tells a story that no amount of diplomatic language can soften. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which approximately 20% of the world's oil supply transits, is now effectively closed. 5 ships made it through on the first day following the ceasefire announcement. 5. The normal daily traffic volume is 110 vessels. Iran has laid mines across critical shipping lanes. Naval assets have been positioned to interdict any vessel that attempts passage without explicit Iranian authorization. And the global oil market is responding with the kind of volatility that reflects a market pricing in the realistic possibility that this closure is not temporary. Tonight's analysis takes you inside the collapse. We examine how a ceasefire brokered under Pakistan's mediation with explicit American commitment fell apart within days of its announcement. We break down the diplomatic contradiction at the heart of Washington's position, the evidence that Trump's team initially included Lebanon in the ceasefire terms, and then reversed course after a direct conversation with Netanyahu. We assess what the Hormuz closure means for global energy security and whether the blockade can be sustained or will force a military response that escalates beyond anyone's current control. And we analyze the emergency diplomatic mission now heading to Pakistan, J.D. Vance, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, a delegation so sensitive that Iran's ambassador to Islamabad tweeted its arrival and then deleted the tweet within hours. A deletion that tells you everything about how fragile and contested this entire process has become. If this channel has been the place where you come for analysis that does not repeat official talking points, that treats you as capable of processing the full complexity of what is happening, this is the moment to make that relationship permanent. Subscribe now. Hit the notification bell. Share this video with everyone in your network who understands that the next 48 hours will determine whether the Middle East pulls back from a regional war or accelerates into one. Drop your assessment in the comments because I want to know, does Vance's mission to Pakistan have any realistic chance of salvaging this? Or is the ceasefire already dead and everything happening now just theater before the inevitable escalation? 3 questions will anchor tonight's full analysis. First, what actually happened to the ceasefire? Multiple diplomatic sources confirm that Lebanon was included in the original terms presented to Iran. How did that commitment disappear? And what does that reversal tell us about who is actually making decisions in Washington's Middle East policy? Second, the Strait of Hormuz closure is not a symbolic gesture. It is an operational blockade with immediate global consequences. Can it be sustained? And what are the realistic options for breaking it without triggering the exact military confrontation the ceasefire was designed to prevent? Third, the Vance delegation to Pakistan is carrying the weight of a collapsing diplomatic framework into negotiations where Iran has already signaled through back channels that its patience with American inconsistency is exhausted. What leverage does Washington actually have left? And is there any path through this that does not end with the ceasefire expiring, Hormuz staying closed, and the region sliding into a conflict that no one can control? The answers require honesty. Let us begin. The ceasefire announcement came April 1st, brokered through Pakistani diplomatic channels after weeks of intensive back-channel negotiations between American and Iranian representatives. The framework was simple in its public presentation. A 2-week pause in hostilities between the United States and Iran. No American military strikes against Iranian territory or Iranian assets. No Iranian attacks against American forces or American-aligned targets in the region. A window for diplomacy to construct something more durable. A chance for everyone to step back from the edge. What was not simple, what the public announcement deliberately left ambiguous, was the question of what happens in Lebanon. Does the ceasefire apply to Israeli operations against Hezbollah? Does it constrain Hezbollah's actions against Israel? Or is Lebanon treated as a separate theater outside the scope of the U.S.-Iran bilateral pause? According to multiple diplomatic sources speaking to CBS News, the answer in the original negotiating framework was clear. Lebanon was included. The ceasefire terms as presented to Iranian negotiators explicitly covered Israeli military operations in Lebanon for the duration of the 2-week window. Iran accepted those terms. Pakistan, acting as mediator, confirmed the understanding to both sides. And for approximately 72 hours, that is what everyone involved believed they were operating under. Then Netanyahu called Trump. The details of that conversation remain classified. But the outcome is visible in the operational record. Within 24 hours of the call, American officials began signaling privately to regional partners that the U.S. position on Lebanon had evolved. The ceasefire applied to direct U.S.-Iran engagement. It did not constrain Israeli freedom of action in Lebanon. Israel retained the right to strike Hezbollah targets at its discretion. And Iran's expectation that Lebanon was covered? That was a misunderstanding that Tehran would need to accept as clarification rather than reversal. Iran did not accept it as clarification. Iran treated it as exactly what it was, a unilateral American change to agreed terms delivered after the agreement was already announced. And Tehran's response was to wait. Not to escalate immediately, not to pull out of the ceasefire publicly, but to wait and see whether Washington's revised position was rhetorical or operational. Whether Israel, emboldened by the American green light, would actually use it. Wednesday, April 8th provided the answer. Israel used it. And the scale of what Israel did, over 100 sites struck across Lebanon in 10 minutes, casualty figures exceeding 300 dead in a single operational window, targeting distributed across residential areas where the distinction between Hezbollah infrastructure and civilian population is functionally non-existent, was designed to send a message. The message was not subtle. The ceasefire does not apply here. We operate in Lebanon on our terms. And if Iran has a problem with that, Iran can respond and face the consequences. Iran's problem is not limited to the principle of the thing, though the principle matters. A government that agrees to ceasefire terms and then watches those terms get unilaterally revised by the other party mid-implementation is a government that loses credibility with its own domestic constituencies if it does nothing. Iran's problem is operational. Hezbollah is not a distant proxy. Hezbollah is an integrated component of Iranian regional strategy. Strikes against Hezbollah in Lebanon are strikes against Iranian strategic depth. And 303 people killed in a 10-minute window is not a limited tactical operation. It is a demonstration of escalation dominance. It is Israel showing Iran that even under a ceasefire framework, even with American diplomatic commitments in play, Israel retains the capacity and the willingness to impose costs at scale. Tehran's calculation now is whether responding to those costs breaks the ceasefire entirely, or whether the ceasefire was already broken by Washington's reversal and Israel's strikes, making Iranian retaliation a response rather than an escalation. That distinction matters enormously in the diplomatic framing, but it matters almost not at all in the operational reality. Because if Iran strikes back, if Hezbollah launches a retaliatory salvo against Israeli territory, or if Iranian forces hit an American asset in the region claiming it was supporting Israeli operations, the ceasefire is finished. And the question of who broke it first becomes an argument that happens while the bombs are falling. Washington's position, the official line coming out of the State Department, and echoed by spokespeople across the administration, is that the ceasefire remains in effect, and that all parties should exercise maximum restraint. Maximum restraint. The phrase landed in Beirut among rescue workers pulling children's bodies from collapsed apartment buildings with the weight it deserved. It landed in Tehran among leadership who had agreed to terms that Washington then revised without consultation with comparable impact. The Vance mission to Pakistan, announced with minimal advance notice and framed publicly as a continuation of ongoing diplomatic engagement, is in operational terms an emergency intervention. Vance is not going to Islamabad to participate in a scheduled round of talks. Vance is going to Islamabad because the ceasefire is collapsing in real time and someone with direct access to Trump needs to sit across from Iranian representatives and figure out whether there is any version of this agreement that Iran is still willing to honor after what just happened in Lebanon. The delegation composition tells you how serious Washington understands the situation to be. J.D. Vance, the vice president carrying the weight of executive authority, Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy to the Middle East, the negotiator who has been working the back channels for months. Jared Kushner, whose presence signals that this is not routine diplomacy but a personal intervention by figures Trump trusts to deliver messages that cannot be entrusted to the normal diplomatic machinery. And then there is the tweet. Iran's ambassador to Pakistan posted a message confirming that an American delegation was arriving for ceasefire discussions. The tweet was live for less than 3 hours before it was deleted. No explanation, no correction, just gone. The deletion itself is the signal. It tells you that someone in Tehran or someone in Islamabad or someone in Washington decided that publicly acknowledging the talks before they happened was creating a problem. Maybe it was domestic pressure inside Iran. Maybe it was a coordination failure. Maybe it was the realization that announcing the talks gives hardliners on all sides a window to sabotage them before they start. Whatever the reason, a deleted tweet about a diplomatic mission this sensitive is not a minor detail. It is evidence of how contested, how fragile, and how vulnerable to disruption this entire process has become. While Vance prepares for Pakistan, the Strait of Hormuz is sending a message of its own. 5 ships on day 1. The traffic volume through Hormuz is not a number that fluctuates wildly under normal conditions. It is stable, predictable, essential. 110 vessels per day carrying crude oil, liquefied natural gas, refined petroleum products, the energy supplies that power economies across Asia, Europe, and beyond. A disruption to Hormuz is not a regional inconvenience. It is a global crisis. Iran's decision to mine the strait and position naval assets to control passage is not an improvised response to the Lebanon strikes. This is a prepared operation. Mining a waterway of Hormuz's navigational complexity requires advanced planning, specialized equipment, and a willingness to accept the international condemnation and the economic costs that come with closing a globally critical shipping lane. Iran prepared this option, and Iran activated it the moment the ceasefire framework began to fracture. The mines themselves, according to satellite imagery analysis and maritime tracking data reviewed by Western Naval Intelligence, are concentrated in the narrowest sections of the strait, where the navigable channel compresses to a width that forces all traffic through a defined corridor. This is not random placement. This is engineered interdiction. You mine the choke points. You position naval vessels at the approaches. And you create a situation where any ship attempting passage without Iranian clearance faces a realistic threat of catastrophic damage. The 5 ships that made it through on day 1 were granted passage deliberately. Iran is not trying to demonstrate that the strait is completely impassable. Iran is demonstrating that passage requires Iranian permission. That distinction is the entire point. A completely closed strait invites immediate military intervention to reopen it. A strait that is open selectively, where Iran decides who passes and who does not, is a strait that Iran controls. And control of Hormuz is leverage. Leverage over oil prices, leverage over global energy security, leverage in negotiations where Iran needs leverage because everything else, the military balance, the economic pressure, the diplomatic isolation, favors the other side. Global oil prices responded within hours. A 40% spike in the first 24 hours following confirmation of the closure. Futures markets pricing in the realistic possibility that the blockade is sustained. Strategic petroleum reserves in the United States, China, Japan, and the EU are being evaluated for potential release to stabilize prices. But reserve releases are temporary measures. They buy time. They do not solve the underlying problem. And the underlying problem is that one nation has just demonstrated it can cut off 20% of global oil supply, and the international community has no immediate answer that does not involve military action in waters where Iran has prepared the battlefield. The American military response options are being evaluated in the Pentagon right now. Mine clearance operations are possible, but slow, dangerous, and vulnerable to Iranian interdiction while they are being conducted. Escorted convoys, American naval vessels providing protection for commercial shipping, are possible, but require a force commitment of a scale that would pull assets from other theaters and would place American ships in direct confrontation with Iranian naval forces if Iran chooses to challenge the escorts. And then there is the option that no one is saying out loud, but everyone is modeling. Strike Iranian naval assets. Strike the mine-laying infrastructure. Degrade Iran's ability to sustain the blockade through overwhelming military force applied rapidly and decisively. That option, the military option, carries an escalation risk so severe that it negates the entire purpose of the ceasefire. You do not break a blockade with airstrikes and naval bombardment, while simultaneously trying to negotiate a diplomatic resolution to the underlying conflict. The two tracks are incompatible, and that incompatibility is the trap that Iran has constructed with extraordinary precision. Vance's mission to Pakistan is therefore not simply about salvaging the ceasefire. It is about finding a path through a situation where Iran has leverage, where Washington's credibility has been damaged by the Lebanon reversal, and where every hour that Hormuz remains closed increases the pressure on Trump to do something decisive, even if that something makes the larger situation worse. The Pakistanis, acting as mediators, are in a position of enormous delicacy. Islamabad has relationships with both Washington and Tehran. Pakistan's intelligence services have maintained communication channels with Iranian counterparts even during periods of maximum US-Iran tension. And Pakistan's own strategic interests, energy imports from the Gulf, economic relationships across the region, require that the Hormuz situation gets resolved without a military confrontation that destabilizes the entire area. But mediation only works when both parties want a deal more than they want escalation. And it is not clear, not at this moment, not after Lebanon, not after Hormuz, that both parties are in that space. Iran's domestic political environment has hardened. The strikes in Lebanon, the American reversal on ceasefire terms, the perception that Trump's word is negotiable under pressure from Netanyahu, all of it has strengthened the hand of Iranian hardliners, who argued from the beginning that negotiating with Washington is pointless because Washington does not honor its commitments.